Well, it's Easter vacation this week, and I want to make sure I do something productive beyond the normal cleaning up, catching up on work, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to try this week to make sure that I read a book all the way through, at least as far as I can get. And in order to keep myself accountable, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make these videos summarizing the chapters as I go through them. So this week, I'm going to try to read as much as I can of F.A. Hayek's The Constitution of Liberty, which I've never read before. It was down between that, Human Action, and maybe Crisis and Leviathan. But I settled on this one because I've never really read that much Hayek before. So, brief background on Friedrich Hayek. He went to school with Ludwig von Mises at the University of Austria in Vienna. He studied under von Wieser, one of the first Austrians after Karl Menger, who wasn't actually as free market as a lot of modern Austrians are at all. That guy was much more inclined to kind of be socialist, actually, despite the fact that today we think of Austrians as this pure free market sort of thing. Hayek is the favorite student of a lot of these people over Mises, and when he eventually graduates, he's not the most free market person ever, but he becomes more that way after he reads Ludwig von Mises' Socialism. Now really there are three Hayeks. There's early Hayek, middle Hayek, late Hayek. Early Hayek writes primarily on purely economic matters, so he writes a lot of essays, books on monetary policy and the business cycle. Middle Hayek does a lot more of, he's getting a little bit disillusioned with the purely economic stuff and not getting sort of recognized for it, so he writes on a ton of different things. Right? He writes on the way the mind works. I think he writes a book called, what is it called? Something about perception. That's, from what I've heard, a pretty famous early work on neurology and how, it's called the sensory order of perception. And the sensory order of perception develops a neurological theory of the brain, and it's one of the first books to do this. And so he's a polymath. He writes on everything. And middle Hayek is the guy who starts writing on all of this different sorts of stuff that he's interested in, and then he kind of returns later in his older age to writing about economics again, once he wins the Nobel Prize. And he feels like, I have this clout and this ability to be recognized now. The Constitution of Liberty, what we're reading, is right on the edge between being a middle Hayek work and a late Hayek work, from my understanding of the issue. So Hayek really covers three things in the introduction to his book. He covers 1, why he thinks the book needs to be written, 2, what the book is and what it isn't, and 3, the structure of the book, the order that he's going to cover things in and what's in each section. So first, why does the book need to be written? Well, the book needs to be written because any society over time, if its ideas are not upkept, those ideas will fall into disrepair. They need to be put in the modern language that we speak today, put into the modern vernacular. Not only that, they need to be applied to modern issues so that people can see that they are still applicable and that they are still mattered. Now, in our society, the problem isn't just that the ideas have fallen into disrepair, but that we've been led astray by these glittery ideas of new utopias, and we start to think about those instead, how we completely redesign and restructure our society, as opposed to thinking about why did we set up society this way in the first place, why did it work so well, and why is that a good thing? And so for Hayek, we need to reclaim those old ideas in order to get good things out of them. Like, even if you disagree with Hayek and you think that we should try to build this better new society, we have a pretty decent society as is. So why not at least take the ideas that cause the society to be the way it is and get as much out of them as we can? So this book should be helpful for everyone for that reason. Now, Hayek has a little bit of a tangent here on why this book is necessary when he talks about people from non-Western countries coming to the West in order to learn about how we did what we did, and then utterly failing to learn about how we did what we did because, we don't know how we did what we did anymore. We've forgotten. And so when we teach them, and when they come here looking for advice on how to make their society more Western and more prosperous, we give them, instead of the ideas that actually made us a prosperous country, these ideas about, like I said before, the glittering new society that we can build out of nowhere. And so they come here, they observe, they get some ideas about how to make a more prosperous country, but they don't understand why those ideas work, giving people freedom to create. And so they go back home and they try to rote copy what they've seen here. And in that rote copying, they do not get the benefit that they would get had they actually understood the principles and ideas, right? If they understood the principles and ideas and they gave their people the freedom to create, they would not have gotten a direct copy of Western society. They would have gotten something unique and different and very, very useful and awesome. But instead, in trying to just copy down exactly what they see, they miss on that. And that's just a tragedy for Hayek. Now, Hayek responds to two responses to why this book is needed. His first argument against why this book might not be needed is something like, well, maybe there's implicit agreement on these ideas still existing in society, so we don't need this explicit restatement, and he expresses doubt about this idea that there's still implicit agreement about the deep importance of liberty, and he also expresses doubt about the idea that, well, if there's implicit agreement, you don't need to explicitly restate it. He thinks you will lose that implicit agreement over time if you don't have the language to think about it correctly and properly. I'm not sure if that's how he'd put it exactly, but that's basically the idea expressed in this paragraph. And secondly, he thinks that today we do understand what these people believed, right? There are books about the history of thought and how these ideas developed and what the ideas are, but we don't really understand why they were believed anymore and the arguments behind them, because we've lost that language, right? We were used to communicate in one way, now we communicate in a different way, and so the ideas and the reasons behind them need to be rephrased. The fact that there are books on these ideas isn't evidence that we still hold the ideas or understand them. Secondly, Hayek goes through this list of things that the book is and that the book isn't. So, subpoint A, the book is not a work of econ, but is rather a work on the philosophy of freedom. The book isn't meant to be an economic treatise on why freedom results in these specific positive effects. Rather, it is an argument for why freedom is important morally and ethically. Secondly, the book is very general and criterion-based. It isn't a specific book on particular policy proposals. Hayek is not attempting to give us a list of all the things we should do as good libertarians or as good classical liberals. Instead, he's trying to give us a restatement of the basic principles, and then it's left up to us to draw out the conclusions of those things and what they in particular mean. He does talk about some practical implications of them to give us an idea of how they ought to be implied, but that isn't the main thrust of the work. Thirdly, he doesn't intend for the book to be critical of alternate ways of organizing society, like socialism, like fascism. Instead, he means the book to be positive, to be a positive holding up of why liberty is good, not a tearing down of why those other societies are bad, even though he may touch on those things. Now, that doesn't mean that positively believing in liberty doesn't imply negative things about fascism or about government control of things. It's just that that's not his focus. He says his goal isn't to close avenues for exploration, but rather to make sure avenues for exploration remained open and don't get closed off. Finally, the book is a book of understanding, not a book of enthusiasm, right? He thinks that you could write a book being a cheerleader for liberty, right? Saying, oh yes, it's so great and wonderful and amazing, but his book is going to be a bit drier than that. He's going to be Hayek and be dry. He has something great that I think is absolutely very, very interesting in this paragraph. He says some people might be disappointed in him because he isn't taking these principles of liberty as being indisputable things, like ethical starting points. You can't violate people's rights, people. Come on, that's just wrong, right? That's not the approach he's going with, and he thinks some people might be disappointed in that. But he says that doesn't mean that he rejects that, right? He does not reject in this book that liberty is important as its own end. He's not a consequentialist, he says in this paragraph. Instead, what he believes is that in order for people to be persuaded that liberty is good and a positive thing in itself, is they need to see the consequentialist parts of it. And so I'm going to read a paragraph here that I think is very, very interesting. So F.A. Hayek says explicitly, we must show that liberty is not merely one particular value, but that it is the source and condition of most moral values. What a free society offers to the individual is much more than what he would be able to do if only he were free. and before this is where he talks about, I am possibly, some readers will perhaps be disturbed by the impression that I do not take the value of individual liberty as indisputable, and that in trying to demonstrate its value, I am possibly making the argument in its support a matter of expediency. So I think that entire paragraph is very good and worth reading. It probably is the whole book, that's why I'm reading it. But Hayek's point here is, hey, this book might seem like I'm a consequentialist, like I'm merely supporting liberty because it has good results. I'm not. I just think that in order for unconvinced people to become convinced, they need to see the consequentialist argument, not just the purely, hey, isn't it great to be free sort of argument. And the last thing Hayek does is he gives the outline for the book overall. So part 1 of the book focuses on why liberty is good, not from an economic perspective, but from the perspective of philosophy, political science, ethics, and anthropology. He lists those 4 things as why liberty is ultimately a good thing. Second section of the book is a historical section. It talks about the positive institutions we have created as a society in order to secure, to quote the U.S. Constitution, the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, right? We create these institutions in order to secure those good things we talked about in part 1. Part 3 of the book is application. He says he's going to deal with some specific policy matters in our current time and how those things ought to be dealt with in order to best be in keeping with what we've talked about in parts 1 and parts 2. One thing that I think is interesting about part 2, where he says he's going to be talking about the historical institutions we created to defend liberty, when he talks about law and history in this section, he doesn't think they're perfect by any stretch of the imagination. He doesn't even think that necessarily all of the things about those institutions, well, are good, obviously, but secondly, not even that the good things are designed. Sounds very Hayekian, right? That a lot of these things aren't necessarily designed to support the liberty that he finds so important and interesting that he thinks they exist to support. He thinks that they're kind of created under a veil, if you will, in the shroud of darkness, not fully knowing what they're being created for, but they kind of flow out of these ideas of liberty. So there are 2 more things to talk about that I couldn't neatly fit into any of the other big points for this chapter. So one of them is just a paragraph that I found particularly interesting about economists, right? Economists are very conservative / libertarian / classically liberal compared to most academic disciplines, right? If you look at the breakdown of academics on the political party they fall in, they're mostly Democrats, they're mostly liberals, and that includes economists. They also, for some reason, academic economists are mostly liberals, but to a way less great extent than other academics. Why is it that economics is so conservative / libertarian? Well, F.A. Hayek gives, I guess it's kind of a Hayekian response. All this stuff blows my mind when I read it, but when I say it out loud, you think, oh yeah, of course, that's what I expect from F.A. Hayek. He basically says, economists are not greater experts in any particular thing. We don't have any greater knowledge than these other people. It's just our area of study is on knowledge and on how people act all the time in such a way that they have way more knowledge than they actually could possibly have, and on how these impersonal, non-thinking organizations create actions that we would usually think of as thinking. And so we're way more skeptical of attempts to plan because our study is study of why it's hard to plan, which is, I guess, just very Hayekian. And it shouldn't have blown my mind as much when I read it. But yeah, of course, that's why economists are more conservative than other disciplines. Finally, last issue that I want to focus on is he ends the chapter with something that I think is important to keep in mind. That the success or failure of his book doesn't depend on his book. It depends on us. It depends whether the spirit and the zeitgeist of the times is one that's willing to accept these ideas of liberty and not keep getting attracted to the shiny things that are over to the side, the promises of these great utopias. So it depends on us whether or not the ideas in this book are going to be persuasive to our modern day and age. All right, thanks for watching, if anybody has watched, and I will see you in the summary of Chapter 1.